The reason our brains are wired to think from what we know, to think by analogy, to make assumptions, because by doing that, we can think very, very quickly. But that's a disservice to coming up with really breakthrough ideas or thinking outside the box. So when you want to think outside the box, you actually really want to break away from all the assumptions, from this way that our brains are wired to think. You want to break away from that, and you actually want to question all the assumptions.
Chris, welcome to Discover More.
Thanks for having me, Benoit.
So Chris, how do we think differently, given that Shazam and Apple have similar ethos, which probably explains why Apple acquired you guys for $401 million in 2018?
Yeah, how do we think differentently? Well, I guess first of all, I'll talk about why we have to think differently, and then I'll answer that. Why do we have to think differently? I think if you think about it, most of us on a personal level are trying to improve our lives in some way. And then hopefully many of us on a professional level or in some way are also have some aspirations to make the world a better place. And how do we achieve both those things, the personal improvement, and how do we achieve making the world a better place through our professional endeavors? Well, the answer is obviously making changes, right? Making changes to things. But if the changes were obvious, then we would just be making them, or we would have already made them. And so I think these changes, these amazing changes, these game-changing changes come through innovation, by coming up with new things. And how do you come up with new things? Well, you have to think differently. That's the key, is just because what's happening is the world is actually constantly changing. The capabilities of technology, what we can do, things that haven't been tried yet. There's a constant evolution going on, and even the problems that we face are constantly changing. And this is creating new opportunities for innovation. But in order to achieve the innovation, we really need to think differently. By just thinking the way we're already thinking, we often miss the opportunities, and we kind of are held back by the norms, the traditions of society, and the pressures to keep things the same. So that's the real reason for thinking differently. Is that thinking differently is like the secret weapon that we all carry in our own brain to enable us to make these changes that can improve our personal lives or improve and change the world for the better.
I think the undercurrent of that is thinking outside the box. I just had a funny quote I heard a while ago saying that when you ask an engineer to think outside the box, they ask you, how big is the box? So how do we think outside the box when we're confined by the paradigm, and the knowledge, and the biases that we're in?
Yeah, that's a sort of a very structured thinking, isn't it? How big is the box as a response? Yeah, and it's kind of exactly what you want to get away with, because in a sense that answer right there represents sort of the problem, which is that our brains tend to think from what we know. As soon as we hear, oh, the box, thinking outside the box, we immediately think from what we know. So we picture a box, we imagine the box, and we think, how big is the box, whatever it is. And that's your brain basically doing what it's already wired to do, which is to think from what you know. And there's a reason our brains are wired to do this, is it's very efficient, right? I mean, we're built for efficiency, right? That's how we survived. So, it's efficient. Imagine that you need to get from the room that you're sitting in right now out to the outside the front door and onto the street. Well, your brain just makes a bunch of assumptions, and you're going to think, okay, well, I'll just open the doors, walk down the hallway, walk out the front door, and then I'll be outside, right? But by doing that, you made all these assumptions. If you questioned all those assumptions and thought, well, how do I know that the doors aren't locked in between? How do I know it's safe to walk through the hallway? How do I know that there's adequate light? And you could question every assumption, but of course that would be very, very inefficient. And it would take you hours to get out the front door if you did that. And so that's the reason our brains are wired to think from what we know, to think by analogy, to make assumptions, because by doing that, we can think very, very quickly. But that's a disservice to coming up with really breakthrough ideas or thinking outside the box, right? So when you want to think outside the box, you actually really want to break away from all the assumptions, from this way that our brains are wired to think. You want to break away from that, and you actually want to question all the assumptions. It can be time consuming and exhausting, but you want to question all those assumptions so that you really start from these basic truths only. And this is also known as first principles thinking, that's used by scientists, of course, and great inventors, Leonardo da Vinci, Steve Jobs, Henry Ford. And so you basically start from only what you know to be these basic truths. And then you can build up possibilities. And that's when you come up with these breakthrough ideas that are just so far outside of what you might normally think. And that's what we call thinking outside the box.
Yeah, I heard you in many interviews saying that our brains are wired to think traditionally. I'm guessing this is what you meant. But before I ask you with a follow-up question, can you maybe explain a little bit more what first principle thinking is?
Yeah, so first principles thinking is this concept of making sure that the starting point of your thinking comes from only what you know to be basic truths. So one example that's often brought up is the story of how Elon Musk created SpaceX, which is now completely transforming what's achievable in terms of getting out to space, right? At very economic costs. And initially, when Elon Musk looked at this concept of sending rockets to space, the traditional thinking, which was based on assumptions, was that it costs this much money to build a rocket and take it out to space, and it was an enormous amount of money. And the story goes that Elon Musk said, well, why does it have to cost that much? What he did is he looked at, well, what are the actual costs of the materials, the basic materials that go into building this rocket, right? And if you think about it, a rocket is made up of materials, right? Like metals and so on. And when he broke down to those as a starting point, he concluded that this could be done for a tiny fraction of the cost to get into space. And no one else was thinking of it that way. And so that's where he started. That's first principles thinking, of just starting from this concept of just what are the basic truths. And the basic truths are that materials cost a certain amount of money. And so therefore you should be able to build a rocket for a sum of these basic costs of the materials. That's basically first principles thinking. And you use the same type of thinking. Scientists use it when they're coming up with new understandings and proofs for different scientific concepts and principles. As I said, sort of inventors, when Henry Ford created the production line for cars, he was trying to think of a way to make a car very economical. You could argue that it was very similar to SpaceX, except rather than rockets, it was cars. And he was very, very set on creating a very, very affordable car. And so he broke it down and thought, well, if we create this sort of sequential assembly line, maybe this is a way to, in a very structured way, create a very predictable and very low cost of assembling the car. And that was, again, starting from the basic truths, not starting from what the assumptions that we already make. So first principles, it's the principles. See, that's the concepts. They're almost like the laws, the truths. That's why they're called first principles. And first principles thinking is to always start from these truths and make sure that you're not starting from any assumptions.
And I think all the great inventors and scientists and just leaders, they stack two different types of thinking. There's many. Is first principle thinking and reverse engineering. Can you go into reverse engineering, since you sort of alluded to that in the assembly line, the materials, the rocket launch, and so on?
I wouldn't say I'm an expert in reverse engineering in any way, but reverse engineering, I think of it's that you're looking at sort of an end product and then trying to break it down to say, how is this created? And so in a sense, you're kind of trying to come back to these sort of basic components. So in that sense, it sort of has a similarity to first principles thinking. But reverse engineering, I think of as more as it's a specific analysis that you're doing of something that's been constructed. Whereas first principles is more of like a way of thinking. Reverse engineering is an actual kind of task that you're taking on in order to try to understand what goes into creating something.
Mm-hmm. So let's go into the nitty gritty of your own process, where, of course, you and Shazam came to fame aside from the acquisition by Apple. Is your audacity to challenge the status quo, right? By asking and, I guess, challenging the familiar. That's another one of your ethos of yours. So can you walk me through your own process of assuming and challenging the assumptions? Because I could be wrong, but I believe your idea, the genesis of idea, was birthed even before iTunes, before iPhone.
I'll tell it to you in the form of the actual story of coming up with the idea of Shazam. So many people think that the idea for Shazam was basically, hey, let's come up with a way to figure out what that song is. right? Often people will come up to me and say, "Oh, wow, how did you come up with that idea of what's that song?" Right? And what I tell them is actually that is not the aha moment or the breakthrough idea of Shazam. In fact, that was actually, a relatively common idea that other people and even companies wanted to solve. It was a known thing that, what are these songs we're hearing? Let's try to figure it out, right? That was a known problem. It wasn't really a novel concept that I came up with that I thought, oh, wow, the world needs to know what song is playing. The way the story played out is that originally I had this idea of what's that song? Yes, that was an idea. That was not the breakthrough idea. And I thought, well, everyone's getting mobile phones. Wouldn't it be great if there was something we can do? You have to keep in mind that this is way before smartphones, right? This idea breakthrough was in sort of late 1999. And so at that time, mobile phones were very simple. They just had a little monochrome screen with 78 by 98 pixels, monochrome, no color. And really, the only thing you did on phones was you made phone calls and you sent text messages. Maybe if you had a Nokia phone, you might play Snake, that game. But that's pretty much it, right? So I was thinking, what else can we do with these phones? There's got to be something else. Everyone's carrying these phones with them everywhere they go. What other idea can we come up with? And that's when I thought, well, wouldn't it be great if we could tell people what the song is that they're hearing? But here is where the really interesting stuff comes in. So my original idea, I thought, well, what technologies are there that can do this? And there were already technologies that monitored radio stations. So they used music recognition technology that was very simple music recognition to listen to the clean signals of radio stations and identify what was playing on these radio stations by pinging them once every minute or two. There's only about 100,000 songs played on all radio stations. And of course, you only have to ping them about once every minute or two because that's how often the song changes on each radio station. And so my original idea was to tie into a service like that. And again, this is thinking from what we know, right? Typical thinking, traditional thinking, and then make a service where you would have to take your mobile phone out, call a number, and then type in the radio station that you're listening to. And then by tying into this technology, we could then tell you what song was playing. But think how limiting that service would have been, right? You had to know the radio station you're listening to. So if you're in a grocery store and you don't know what the radio station is, that's no good. And then you have to type it in, and that's a bit of a clunky experience, having to type in the radio station each time. And then of course it wouldn't work anywhere that's not radio, right? So if it was a bar or a club or even a movie, that's not radio, and it wouldn't work in those situations. That was my original idea. And in fact, 6 other companies were all doing that idea. And the real aha moment of Shazam was when I thought, wait, hold on, what could someone do that would leapfrog me and make me irrelevant if I built that service, right? And make me irrelevant. What could someone do? Irrelevant. What could someone do that would make my company defunct, that would sort of leave me in the dust? And because that, honestly, every entrepreneur needs to think that way. You need to always be thinking about the future, and the way you think about the future is you try to think, well, what could someone do that would disrupt you, right? And make you irrelevant. And so I was thinking about that, and that's when I had the aha moment of Shazam, because that's the moment when I thought, hold on, what if you didn't need to know what was playing on the radio? Hold on, what if you could just figure it out from the music in the air coming to the microphone of the phone? And that was how we would identify songs, right? And that was a breakthrough idea no one had done at that time, because of course you have many challenges, right? You have the fact that there's ambient noise around you. You have, it could be people talking in a bar. You have the fact that this would have to work on not just the 100,000 songs played on the radio, but the many, many tens of millions of songs that are played anywhere. And then you would also have to scale it computationally so that it would work. You'd run this identification, not just every time a song gets played on the radio, but you're running the identification every time someone calls into Shazam. So that was the breakthrough concept, and it required inventing a unique technology. That really comes from thinking differently, right? That was by a novel concept that really started from first principles.
I want to talk about novelty because you talked about it twice. I think people have this illusion that novelty has to be the first iteration. I'm thinking about Netflix and Amazon. Some people don't know that Amazon started off as an online bookstore, and now Amazon is much more than a book entity. Same for Netflix. Netflix now is not what it used to be, and it took iterations and iterations and iterations to repackage, re-evolve, and readapt to the new marketplace and the new needs. And similar to what you talked about, the current Shazam that it became known as is not the first Shazam that was birthed out of. And I just want to talk about iterations process and what do you think about that? Why is it dangerous for people to think that life or technology is a linear? Because it's not linear and life is not linear. It's exponential and ebbs and flows. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that basically the danger, the kind of lazy approach is to just get comfortable with the sort of the status quo, the way that we lead our lives and the way that we're running our businesses and so on. And it is a danger because there's a natural comfort with that. And the examples that you brought up are what are great success stories that come from the opposite of that, right? It's from pushing a feeling of discomfort, from making sure that you're always trying to think ahead and almost reinvent yourself. It's Netflix's big investment to reinvent itself from a CD mail order service into a digital streaming service is one great example of that. Shazam, we did it multiple times. We actually reinvented our business model even at Shazam several times, over 5 times. Yeah, when Shazam first launched, it was pay per use. Every time you use Shazam, there was a 50 cents charge on your mobile phone bill. And then later it was selling digital music downloads. So downloading an iTunes song to your phone. Then later there was licensing, where we would license Shazam onto to different mobile phone carriers and mobile phone handsets. And then actually it evolved into streaming and advertising, and even advertising within Shazam. But I think it's critical for every business, but also every individual, to be constantly trying to question the way they're doing things now and think about how could I shift things up? How could I change things? How could I kind of disrupt myself and as a result grow? And I think that's the key to really getting to where we want to get to.
I had another questions where I want to talk about critical juncture very briefly. Right. In a layman's terms, critical juncture just means that a certain event that happens that had this instrumental impact, and by changing the landscape, it's usually for political, economics, and so on. Can you think about a few critical junctures that really, I think, allowed you to get to where you are today based on your journey, not just as a Shazam necessarily, but you as a startup founder, you as an inventor, and so on?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I believe that we all, as individuals, we all have strengths and we have weaknesses, right? That's just the way we're sort of born with these strengths and weaknesses, and we can get better at certain things. But the reality is that there's certain things that are our aptitudes, they're our natural strengths. And for me, a critical juncture was coming to the realization of what my strengths were versus what my weaknesses were. I am, I'm sort of self-diagnosed dyslexic, and my son is dyslexic. So I get to see another experience of many of the challenges that I faced as my son has faced challenges in his academic career. So as a result, certain things are really difficult for me, and I'm not good at them. And so I think this critical juncture came from this realization that, oh wow, there's certain things that I am good at. Because what's interesting about dyslexia is that there's certain advantages that you have, certain sort of superpowers, and recognizing what those are is helpful, because then you can really focus on making the most of your strengths, and then relying on other team members to be able to execute on where your weak areas are. And that realization, I think, was so critical for me, because it enabled me to be an entrepreneur. Because when you're an entrepreneur, there's this feeling that you're going to have to be able to do everything, and you can't drop the ball on anything, because otherwise your business will collapse. And the truth of the matter is, no, that many of the things that you need to achieve, you're going to solve those by finding someone who's really good at that. And that's the secret to great entrepreneurship.
I resonate that deeply because, years ago when I was bored at my job, I self-taught Python for 3 months, just so I understand the basic tenets of coding and commanding the language, if and then, so to speak. But then I think a year ago, I gave 5% of the equity for the podcast business to one of my longtime friends, and he's a coder. So he's a tech officer and he's an equity partner. because I saw the impact and the role of AI in content generations early on. And I knew I didn't have the specialty of that or the capacity or the interest. So I gave my 5% equity. In turn, I have his back, and he's an R&D for AI and machine learning. So it's right in it's a perfect match and intersection. And I'm already reaping the benefits of having an AI expert on the podcast for the content generations, algorithmic identification, and so on. But I want to quickly go back into, you talked about you have undiagnosed dyslexia and you also taught your son, which we'll go into. How did you get into UC Berkeley and Cambridge University for 2 masters with your air quote learning disability?
Right. Well, look, there's many dyslexics that have found their way to being big achievers, right? But one example is like, I think, a teacher might assign you to write an essay, and that just seems absolutely overwhelming to me. I mean, especially when it's related to some novel that you just read, it just feels absolutely overwhelming to write this essay based on this novel, and it's just literally feels like you're just a deer in the headlights. You just don't know what to do. Often with the challenges of dyslexia, and so what I showed my son, and I made me realize this is what I would do, is that I would go find a whole bunch of sort of facts and conclusions that were just random and unrelated in some way, and I would just write them down as like little bullet points, like a list of bullet points. And then after that, and once I had this list of bullet points, I would then kind of categorize them. So I had 4 or 5 categories, each with several bullet points. And then from there, I would then turn them into sentences. And then from there, I'd turn them into paragraphs and write a little introductory sentence, concluding sentence, or transition sentence from each paragraph, until finally you end up with an essay. In a way, what I was doing, I was turning reading and writing into a mathematical exercise, something that was highly analytical. And it was basically turning this essay writing process into math, essentially, and a form of math. But that's just one example of the types of coping mechanisms I think that someone with dyslexia can come up with. The challenges never went away. So I'll give you an example. When I went to Berkeley for college, I would choose my classes. The way I would choose the classes I could take is I would go into this sort of academic center where they had all the courses listed, and then they also had the syllabus for each course, the reading list. I was terrified of a course that might have several big books of reading, because that would just completely crush me. That would just take so much time for me to do, and it would feel nearly impossible. So I would literally just make sure I would do everything I could to avoid those courses by going and doing all my research ahead of time, and selecting the courses that didn't have huge amounts of reading. Instead, I ended up going with a kind of mathematical plan of economics ultimately, and that felt like very surmountable for me and what I was good at.
So I want to quickly provide some education. As you know, we're in the era of peak misinformation and peak disinformation. What really is dyslexia? And since you can't really trust everything you read online, and I know in your interview with Tony Robbins, you said that dyslexic thinking is big picture thinking. So it's a 2-part question. Part 1, what really is it? And part B, what do you mean by it's a big picture thinking?
Yeah. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time on this, because I think this is very, very interesting. So maybe we can break it into a couple questions if you like. I actually even did a little research on this, because one thing that I think is really interesting is that when you're dyslexic, that does not mean that you are an academic expert in dyslexia, right? Obviously. So you can be dyslexic, but it's not like you therefore are able to self-analyze your brain and say, this is how my brain works, and this is what's hard for me, and this is what's easy for me, and here's why. And so for a long time, I think dyslexics, you just kind of live the way you live, and you know that some things are hard and some things you're good at, but you don't really know why. And this all changed for me actually relatively recently, because I read a fantastic book, which I really want to plug because I just love this book. And I think everyone who suspects they're dyslexic or is a family member who is dyslexic, I would really encourage them to read this book. It was game changing for me. And it's called The Dyslexic Advantage by Brock and Fernette Eide, I think, E-I-D-E. And I believe that they come from backgrounds as an educator and a neurologist. And so it's a really fascinating book because it really, really dives into dyslexia. And what really I found it fascinating is it really helps you understand what are the challenges as a dyslexic, and they're more than just reading. That was very eye-opening. And then the second thing is it helps you also understand what your secret superpowers are, what your advantages are. We all understand that dyslexia is a language and reading. We think of it as a reading disorder, the difficulty reading. And its cause comes from the way that the brain processes language and information. And that's important to note that it's not just language, not just reading, but it's language and information. So it's also the processing of information, which includes memory. So that was a big eye-opening thing for me from the book, is that it's not just about the actual phonetical part of reading, but it's also the way that we use our memory to do processing. So what's called working memory is sometimes watching a whole movie. I don't know if you remember an old movie. There was an old movie called The Usual Suspects. And it was it had quite a complex plot. I remember coming out of that movie in the theater and just having no idea what happened in this movie. And all my friends understood it. It was a complex plot, but that's an example of where dyslexic can be challenged because of the way we process information. Even watching a complicated movie with a very complicated plot can be challenging, and you can feel very, very confused. Obviously, some famous people that are dyslexic: Richard Branson, the creator of the Virgin Group, the founder of IKEA, the founder of Charles Schwab, the founder of AT&T Wireless, which was called Macaw Cellular, Henry Ford, Ted Turner,
Wow.
Walt Disney, Gavin Newsom, Leonardo da Vinci. All these people were dyslexic, which I think is just, so inspiring. Dyslexics, they're challenged, right? They're challenged really by three main things. They're challenged by interpreting letters and sounds. They're challenged by interpreting then words and the meanings, stringing these words, stringing these sounds together to create words, which feels like assembling a puzzle where the pieces don't fit.
So are you able to use your categorization approach even onto like movies and other informations beyond writing essay, and like categorize into like deconstructing? Like, does that approach work for most information processing?
Yeah. I mean, the answer is basically yes, you can use it, but like, you would literally, like, one way you use it is that, like, when I watch movies, like on a streaming thing, I'll often like rewind and rewatch things. So sometimes you need a different set of tools. This is why dyslexics can thrive when they're given sort of what are called accommodations. And my son has an individualized education program at school, and he's given, like many dyslexics, they're given extra time to do tests. And with that extra time, you can start to use these other methods, because your intelligence is not suffering when you have dyslexia. It's just that you need to use other systems basically to be able to do the work. And those things often take time. So you might need to like listen to things rather than read things, watch videos. You might need to take notes. Now, clearly that, it's a lot more labor intensive to do that than just simply reading it as most people would do. But with the extra time and about applying these structured organization methods that are similar to the compartmentalized system that we talked about with bullet points, yeah, you can find coping mechanisms basically.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That explains why the work ethics are pronounced with all the great, like, right, Richard Branson, all these people have great work ethics, because the labor intensive nature of your diagnosis. It makes sense. By like overcoming that, you have to have impeccable work ethics. But please go back to the superpowers and competitive advantage, so to speak, because there's a lot of exciting new research about ADHD as well. Like, people with ADHD has increased lateral thinking, convergent thinking, divergent thinking, and it has huge boost in a domain of creativity. So what are the superpowers you've been hinting at?
Yeah. Okay. So really, I'm going to list out kind of the main superpowers really. So one is creativity. Another one is problem solving skills. And so it's not to say that, that other people don't have creativity. It's just that dyslexics can have sort of enhanced capabilities of creativity, enhanced capabilities in problem solving, enhanced capabilities in spatial reasoning, and enhanced capabilities in it's called what we think of as intuitive thinking. And then finally, an enhanced sort of empathy and emotional intelligence in certain ways. Those would be the main thing. And actually, there's one additional one that's not, I don't think of as being an inherent advantage of the brain itself, but it's more of a result of the experience of being dyslexic, is it can be an enhanced adaptability and resilience. And that really comes from the fact that as a dyslexic, in all those formative years of your childhood, you're facing so many challenges and setbacks, and you just can't understand why you're struggling with basic things. It makes you feel really dumb, frankly. And because you have to just work so hard to overcome them, find these coping mechanisms, and deal with the fact that you're frankly failing on what often seem like basic tasks compared to non-dyslexics. Over time, you sort of foster this kind of resilience and adaptability that comes with having survived all that. It allows you to be less likely to be discouraged by obstacles, more likely to view kind of failures as learning opportunities, and just have a higher tolerance for risk, because you've learned to kind of play out all the different possibilities and envisioning the different possibilities as you calculate your risk and reward.
That's actually a perfect segue with the adaptability and, I guess, contextualized application of what many people call disorder. In your case, you're able to implement and apply them very optimally, which is why you became the founder of Shazam. Earlier, you talked about one of the critical junctures of your life was learning to delegate, which you're not good at, based on your temperament, personality, or brain structure, and anything between. I want to flip the table. Conversely, what were the areas that you really thrived? Maybe problem solving, maybe creativity, because of your dyslexic background.
One of them, it's known as you alluded to a little earlier, this big picture thinking. And it's also, I think academically in this book, they call it interconnected reasoning. And it's a way that the dyslexic brain processes information it leads to this advantage, I believe, and based on the writings in this book, related to the traditional way that brains are formed, in the sense that you're able to really see relationships and causality and see the broader implications on the world in a better way. This big picture, you're able to see the big picture, which we might just call it intuition, right? Gut instinct. And you're making all these connections between these seemingly disparate ideas, seeing these relationships and recognizing patterns in human behavior. And these are the things that can lead to really novel ideas that can help in creation of a new entrepreneurial pursuit that I definitely feel was like something that I could bring to the table and really make the most of in creating Shazam. Because if you think about it, when you're creating Shazam, you're basically envisioning this future of something that people would do with mobile phones. You're sort of seeing out into what people might do and recognizing the opportunity. And then we had to find a way to get there. And there's just so many obstacles along the way. How are we going to create a music database when we didn't have any music? And how are we going to build this search engine from scratch? And how are we going to get partnerships with mobile phone companies that were unprecedented? No one had ever gotten these types of partnerships. Back then, it was a 4-digit phone number that we had to secure from all the mobile phone companies. And how are we going to convince these huge mobile phone companies that are bureaucracies to give us this number that they hadn't even given to huge famous companies like Domino's Pizza, United Airlines, 1-800-Flowers? These are big companies that already drive a lot of revenue, but they didn't get a 4-digit phone number. So why should we as a startup get a phone number? And how are we going to convince these executives to give it to us? And all the solutions for these things that frankly seem so insurmountable at the time you're facing them, that most people would just naturally give up, because that would be the logical thing to do, because it just seems insurmountable. But I feel like that's where my dyslexic superpowers would come in, and I would sort of be able to see down the road and see this path of, this is how we're going to get there. I think it can be done. And this is the strategy we're going to use. And here's the reason I think it's worth putting in all this effort to get there. And that's the superpower that dyslexics I think all dyslexics can take advantage of. It's not a superpower that often pays off in a single academic class, right? So it doesn't show itself necessarily as a grade. And if they're taking a class like a history class, an English class, even a math class, it won't show up in the academic records, but it does show up in the bigger picture of achieving in life. Because when you're achieving in life, you're really trying to come up with, look what you did in creating this podcast, right? Like, you had a vision of what you wanted to create, something that was different and unique from other podcasts. You had a vision for the type of information that certain sets of people would find really, really valuable. You had a vision of how you were going to bring that information to life by interviewing certain people with certain backgrounds and focusing on certain aspects of that. And all that vision, seeing far ahead, because it's not proven. There's no market research book you can just read and say, yes, this is here's the way to create this very successful podcast. No, you didn't have anything like that. You had to kind of have the vision, see ahead, and kind of invent the path along the way to get there. And that's the superpower that I think dyslexics can take advantage of, because it's something that they have some natural strengths in.
And not to mention, one of your 12 patents is being utilized by Google search engine as we speak, from my research, right? And it's like, again, like your ability to see past the current paradigm, air quote, the out of the box thinking we alluded to earlier. And also, I have to say this, I'm not dismissing your work ethics, the mental resilience, the obstacles, the adaptation, all that. You're not here. Chris Barton didn't become the Virgin Mobile founder because of dyslexia. That's just one of the features. And I don't really talk about work ethics on this podcast because that's given. Everyone I interact on this podcast has impeccable work ethics, impeccable resilience, a lot of ability to overcome and internalize and even flip the table based on the hardships. So I don't really talk about that explicitly because that's given. But I do want to make the ad notes that you're not here because of dyslexia. With who you are, you just found ways to utilize that to your advantage.
Yes, exactly. And again, it comes back to what I was saying, is that I really believe that, everyone has strengths and weaknesses. And that's such an important thing to recognize, because sometimes we get ourselves down about our weaknesses, right? I mean, like, imagine if you decided that you should have done all the AI stuff yourself. As you mentioned with the Python code, you probably wouldn't be that great at it. It would take a bunch of time and it wouldn't always go the way you're hoping. You would have coded things that just simply didn't work, didn't have impact, didn't see results. And maybe the code wouldn't have worked. In certain cases, it would have just had bugs and not actually executed at all. And then you could just be like, I just can't do this, right? I wanted to create this amazing podcast that was great at using AI for content generation as well, but I just can't do it. But instead, the key is, just like a dyslexic or anyone else, we all have these strengths and weaknesses. And the key is to just be very sort of aware, the awareness of what we're good at, and the awareness of what we're not good at is such a valuable thing to spend time on, to build that awareness. Because when you have that self-awareness, then you can just say, look, this is something I'm not good at. There's certain things I'm just not good at this. I recognize it. Doesn't mean that I'm a failure. Doesn't mean I can't achieve all the things I want to achieve. I'm just going to be aware of what I'm good at. And then I'm going to fill the gaps by working with people on things that I'm not good at, because it's about building teams. All the greatest things that are created come from teams, right? Even when you read a novel, there's a team behind that novel. There's an author, but they often have editors and people that have assisted them, obviously, even in some of the as solitary, as perceived as being as solitary as creating a novel. But certainly in any company that's created by an entrepreneur, we tend to attribute that to, Richard Branson created that. No, Richard Branson was the entrepreneur. What he did is he created teams of people, and those teams are what made Virgin successful. And that's certainly what made Shazam successful, is bringing together amazing teams.
I want to zoom in on the undercurrents of ownership very briefly. I think it's interesting where I've interviewed a lot of entrepreneurs the first 2 years of the podcast, until I realized people don't really care about entrepreneurship on this podcast, unless like you yourself, where there's a psychological undertone with everything you do. I bring that in because entrepreneurs and great people become great because they take ownership of their failures and successes. They take everything on. You have to do everything. But then what I learned is what separates great entrepreneurs from good entrepreneurs is their ability to let go and relinquish their ownership by creating a team. Like my example, giving away equity. I don't care about the ownership of a podcast. I just want to create the best podcast there is, period. And if that means I have less equity, so be it. Zero care about that. That's just my personality trait. Because I realized for a lot of folks, entrepreneurs or leaders, just thought leaders that I come across in the podcast or in real life, what allowed them to get that far is the very thing that stops from getting farther, if that makes sense. Right? Because of your work ethics, because your ability to internalize all the failures, and really trying to deconstruct and learn from that, it got you to a certain point. But then if you carry that same approach, you can't, I guess, move past the next stage because new levels, new devils.
I believe that one danger we can face is power, right? Is that the desire for power sometimes is in conflict with doing what's best for whatever you're creating. And so, I think one method that I've always used is that I've just focused on the fact that I really don't care about the power aspect. I don't need to be the one that takes credit for things. I don't need to be the person. Frankly, even in the early days of Shazam, when we raised venture capital money, one of the first things we did, I was the original CEO of the company. But as the company grew and became a bigger and bigger company, I recognized that, look, I need a real CEO. And I agreed with our venture capitalists. We're going to bring in sort of seasoned leader CEOs. And by the way, we often read about startups that are still led by their founders, such as Mark Zuckerberg leading Facebook and so on. But there's many examples where that's not the case. Larry and Sergey very early on went and got a CEO hire for Eric Schmidt. And there's other examples, and often they can be a very collaborative relationship between the founders and the CEO. And so I think that that's very important is to recognize recognize that you don't necessarily need to take all the credit, have all the power, but this is something, it may be a creation that you came up with, but recognize that the ultimate success outcome comes from sharing with the people, sharing the entire experience with others that can contribute, right? But that's why it's so important to pick, though, a really great team. All those initial people, all the individuals that join you, that part is extremely important. It can't just be anyone. It's got to be people that you respect, that add a lot of value, that I like to say act like founders. They have the passion and that you can collaborate well with, that you have mutual respect with.
Yeah, I guess my least favorite part of owning this business is like all the peripheral things: hiring, firing, looking for contractors. Like my video editor, who's been with me for 7 months, is departing. So now I have to rehire, going through vetting process again. But people are like, oh, just find someone that's nice and good. There's too many nice and good people. They have to be good. They have to be nice. They have to have integrity. They also have to be good at what they do. There's so many criteria that people don't really think about. And like human resources and managing talent is single-handedly the most important and also the hardest thing for most business venture, as you know deeply well. But I just want to kind of talk about that because finding the right team, identifying the right folks to fill in that team, that in turn enhance your visions and really push this creation forward, not because of you, like the power you talked about, but because it's a collective impact and collective vision. Because I really believe that to achieve collective impact, which most things requires collective contribution as well.
Yeah, in fact, that brings to mind what I consider to be sort of a gold nugget of advice for anyone building teams. Obviously entrepreneurs, but really anyone that is trying to build teams. One of the secrets is to bring on board people that just have that passion, right? That really are going to go beyond what they've done in the past and really keep pushing to make something amazing. I would like, as I like to say, act like a founder. And in fact, I joined Google when it was a pretty young company. I joined Google when it was 2,000 people. It was still a private company, so it was about 6 months away from going public. And I have so much admiration for the incredible people that Google had hired. One thing I found fascinating is that many of the people they hired were not experts in something. They were just very driven and very smart. And again, the secret is to find these people like act like founders, not just simply doing what's they're sort of assigned to do.
That's so good. And that also makes me more sad because my current editor is the best editor I had in 4 years. Because when I hired him, he asked, hey, at one point, can I implement my own strategies and approaches to your video editing? I was like, damn, I struck gold because I saw the innovations. I saw his willingness to take that leap, even though I'm hiring him. He wasn't just satisfied with, yep, tell me X, Y, and Z, I'll execute them to your liking. He's like, no, when can I actually start doing my own thing to your vision? And he was the best, single-handedly the best editor I had for 7 months. But yeah, I just want to echo that deeply. And I want to actually go into the passion you talked about. I think that there's different levels of passion. And I think I guess the epitome of passion is obsession. Why is obsession often required to break through status quo?
Yeah, it's a great question. So here's the answer. The answer is that the word obsession, like many things in life, is a matter of perspective, right? And so I believe that when you're creating something, often the secret comes from the fact that you have this insight, right? You have an insight that you have, but others don't have, right? So it's a unique insight, right? And it's known in the entrepreneurship world as a non-consensus insight. So the consensus does not necessarily agree with you, but you have this insight. And again, using your podcast as an example, right? You had this insight of there was an opportunity to create this amazing podcast with this amazing focus. That was your insight, but it wasn't generally recognized. Otherwise, there would be 100 of those podcasts already. So what happens is that when you have that insight, you believe in it, right? You really believe in your insight. And of course, you press forward on it. Hopefully, you really push forward to make it a reality. But what happens is that all the people around you that don't see the insight, which is, again, as we talked about, it's the majority of people in this case, because it's a non-consensus insight. They think, well, why is Benoit? Oh my gosh, he's spending all this time creating this podcast. Why? I mean, there's already so many podcasts out there. Why does he want to create this podcast? And they don't understand it. And so you know what they think? They think he's obsessed. He's obsessed. He's obsessed with this thing. It's just, I don't know why he's so obsessed with it, because they don't get it. They don't see the vision that you have. And that's why I call it pick your obsession, is because it is an obsession as perceived by others. But for yourself, it's not an obsession. For yourself, it's your big insight that you have, that vision you have, and that you realize it's there. It's going to be really hard to get there. And as you try to get there, you will face a lot of resistance. I give this example of Galileo, right? He saw that the earth revolved around the sun, and my gosh, did he face resistance, right? I mean, it was even tried in court for heresy. And so much resistance from people that don't believe in it. You face resistance, and that resistance can come from all around you. It can come from your friends, your significant other, your partners, the people that are funding you, your employees. It can come from everywhere. It really can be around you. And that's why we often give up. We often give up because, how hard is it to do something? Imagine you're starting a company and, you have 2 co-founders and 3 investors, right? And that make up your board, and 5 employees. And imagine you say, we really need to do this because you really believe in it. We really need to do this. But your co-founders say, no, we disagree. That's a big waste of time and money. Your investors say, look, we gave you, $2 million of funding, and we don't think that's a good use of your time and money. You should focus on other things. And even your employees just find a hard time doing it because they don't believe in it. Well, guess what? That's a lot of resistance. And most people just simply give up at that point. They just say, okay, I guess this idea I have, this insight I have, others, I just can't do it because I can't get people on board. And that's why actually having an ability to be persuasive is actually so core and important for a successful entrepreneur, because you've got to be persuasive to get people on board, to get your team to believe in your vision, right? To convince your investors. I can guarantee you so many entrepreneurs have stories where they had to convince their investors and boards to back certain things. I don't know if you know, but in the story of Henry Ford, actually the pressure from the investors was to build an expensive car, to build a car for the elite and the wealthy. That was the pressure coming from the people backing all around Henry Ford. And he had this obsession of, no, what we need to do is build the affordable car to just drive down costs and build something that can be bought by everyone. And that was his big insight that others didn't see. And so that's why I call it pick your obsession. And it really is an obsession. It feels like an obsession because of the fact that everyone doesn't agree with you, that they're putting this resistance against you. But really, the truth of the matter is, to you, it's not an obsession. To you, it's the big insight you have that others don't have.
I didn't know about the Henry Ford fact, but similar to Volkswagen, which means people's car. Of course, Hitler started that, which dented the history, but that was the same ethos. Let's make a car for the people. Also, what you said about like the non-consensus insight reminds me of a quote that Jeff Bezos famously said. He said, "Your margins is my profitability." And that's how Amazon really thrived. And it's really true. It's like where you think there's no opportunities is my gold mine. And I'm going to double down on it based on everything we talked about, the vision, the great team. work ethics, and obviously he's one of the smartest people out there. But I think that also like leads us into the core of what you just said, resistance. But I want to talk about emotional resistance versus cognitive resistance. A lot of people still think in 2024 that humans are logical animals. That's been proven false. We are emotional animals because social is emotions. What makes people connect? It's not through stats and facts. You tell me one example where you connected over someone else over stats and facts. It doesn't happen. You connect through emotions, and emotions imply social. So humans are emotional animal. And that's why we still have all these issues in the world because stats and facts don't work. So going back to what you said, Chris, why is it harder and why is it important? Like, why is it paramount to actually overcome people's emotional resistance versus their cognitive resistance with everything you said?
You're 100% right. Emotions are what are most powerful and what we connect with. Ultimately, our way of being persuasive and our way of influencing people has to come from what actually moves people, and emotions are what move people. And I've learned that a lot as I'm a keynote speaker now, and I've sort of, like everything, I like to do things well. So I studied like crazy keynote speaking and what makes the best speaker successful and so on. And there were things that were completely non-obvious to me. And one of them is that, everything is based, the most powerful thing is stories. Stories are what people remember. Stories are how people learn. Stories are people take in what you're speaking about. And in particular, stories that touch on the emotions. And that's what I found has resonated most in my speaking, has been the emotional aspect of the story. So it's fascinating because the analytical side of myself wants to say, oh, if I quote these statistics that Shazam faced, that will be just so mind-blowing, like, oh, we had this percentage of users that did this, and we faced, these were the economics, and we had this much funding, and I mean all these numbers, right, that sit in your head. But the real things that people love and they embrace is the emotional journey that I bring them on of my own personal experience of overcoming these seemingly insurmountable tasks, of the downtimes that we faced when we nearly went bankrupt for not just 1 year or 2 years, for 6 consecutive years of just barely surviving, all the hardships that we faced. And then, of course, now luckily Shazam ends in a Hollywood style story with like a fantastic outcome where then we became a hugely successful app with 2 billion downloads and bought by Apple. So it makes for a great story, but it's that emotional journey that many of us can relate to, because we've all had those times in our life where we faced really, really difficult times. We almost wanted to give up on something, and we just kept, but it was important to us. So we kept trying. People told us it can't be done or we can't do it. And then eventually we proved them wrong, right? And we all hear those stories, and we've personally experienced those stories in some way, right? Just it's a natural part of childhood, I believe, and growing up. We all relate to that feeling of like, of having to overcome all those difficult things, and then finally getting to where you want to get to. So
I agree. I do. I mean, that's what the core tenets of salesmanship is: storytelling. And I'm not talking about snake oil salesmen, right? But it really is true. You want to bring that onto this journey you either created or you went through. But I want to talk about the other side of the stories that people don't think about. And as a podcaster, I really relate with this, where I have amazing people like you on the podcast. I'm very open to being vulnerable as a psychotherapist concurrently. And I share a lot of my experiences, the guests share their experience in a very authentic way. Because the people I seek out are authentic. And as I told you before offline, I don't go after viral people. Virality is short term. I'm going for the classics, which is timeless. I share that because even a lot of the audience tell me that, oh man, amazing stories, X, Y, and Z. But part of me know deep inside, and it kind of makes my heart ache a little bit, is they're simply taking that as stories, simply as content. Sure, we're in this era of content machine, we're in this era of content farming, so to speak. But I just want to put this on a podium where stories are the visceral experiences we've gone through. We've internalized, we've embedded into our memories that become stories that we feel called to share with other people. But they're not just stories, they're lived, visceral experiences that we're called to share to other people. Because it's not always for us to keep. I think we're called to share what could provide value for the people. I know you feel the same way. I feel the same way because podcast is an extension of my effort to be an educator. I educate people in my psychotherapy practice, and now I also educate people in the podcast. That's why I'm obsessed with it, because I do have a vision like you talked about. But I just want to highlight the nuances with stories where, yes, stories is the primary way to deliver and disseminate information. That's how our brains are wired. At the same time, it's much more than stories. These are real lived experiences that took years, in your case, 20 plus years to get to where we are. So I just want to add that end note because it's not just content. It's much more than that.
Yeah, and it makes sense that stories are so fundamental, right? Because for so many thousands of years, we didn't have ways of recording things in books and YouTube videos, right? So stories that was content. Verbal description of a story was the form of content that existed, and the way that people passed it on and remembered it was by really getting into the story and explaining the story. So yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? It's fun. It makes life fun. I'm glad that we all thrive on stories. It's much more interesting than just passing down a bunch of statistics.
Another thing I want to talk about with stories is another very big story that I want to talk about America as a context, right? Because for Americans, I know you have 3 different citizenship, but a big story that Americans strive for, the middle class, is once I make it financially, like creating a unicorn startup like you, selling it for $400+ million. Once I make it, I'm going to retire, sip a margarita on the beach for the rest of my life. But that's not what you're doing. You're going for the startup. You're trying to create more impact by helping prevent people drowning in the pool and so on. Because I want to really challenge the status quo of what this dream so many people are striving for. Once you make it, then you can just relax and retire. Because the reality of retirement is not what really people think it is.
I've read my fair share on happiness and how to achieve the mental state that we want to achieve. And you've got a few key ingredients that I believe are important. So clearly health and sleep and rest is important, and maybe some time in nature is important. But one of the fundamental ones in the category that's going to be a bit surprising in the category of this sort of achieving this healthy mental state is a sense of purpose. And a sense of purpose comes from something that you're aiming to achieve and getting, making progress towards achieving. And, we typically fill that with our careers, whatever we're working on. And it's so fundamentally important. I mean, I think we all imagine, oh, maybe I'll make a bunch of money and just sit at the poolside all day, sit at the beach, and then I'll be so happy. But actually, I think, as you said, I think that would be very disappointing and would not lead to happiness. And that's why you see, I think, incredibly successful people like Bill Gates, working so hard, right, on a new thing. Once they've made a lot of money on something, I get a lot of enjoyment from my sense of purpose, and really I feel that with 2 main professional things. One is in my keynote speaking and thought leadership. It's all around being able to help motivate and inspire other people to further their own, whatever they're working on, their own careers and their own personal lives through the stories of Shazam and some of my takeaways and learnings on how to think differently. So that's one big category. I was keynote speaking, and also I'm starting the process of writing a book. But basically, you can call it thought leadership and it's inspiration of others. I find that incredibly rewarding, and I speak to audiences with thousands of people, and it's I love that feeling of how they are inspired and they go and do new things as a result of these experiences. And then the second thing is I have this impact-driven startup that you alluded to called Guard. And that's my own. It's just a personal project, very early stage at this time. Hasn't raised funding because I recognize how quickly a company that raises money starts spending it. You can hit the wall, run out of money, and if you haven't achieved what you need to achieve, it's game over. So I'm I've been incubating this startup, solving little things with minimal amounts of capital, my own money. It's called Guard. The goal is to prevent drowning in swimming pools. So as I said, it's impact driven. It's not trying to be $1 billion company. It's not financially driven, but think of it like a self-driving car meets a smoke alarm in a swimming pool. In the sense that a smoke alarm, you install it on your roof and that's it. One time thing. You don't have to think about it anymore. This would be a piece of hardware you install in your pool. A one-time thing, you don't have to think about it anymore. Like a self-driving car, it has cameras and it uses artificial intelligence, computer vision to watch what's going on in its world. And its world is the view of the underwater. And so if people are in the pool, it's looking for someone that might be drowning. So identification of drowning is the really challenging part of this problem, because, someone just holding their breath underwater is not drowning. Someone just laying on the water is not drowning. Someone that falls into a pool is not necessarily drowning, but there's a certain thing that's actually drowning where you're really struggling for air. So identification of drowning is the very technically challenging problem. The vast majority of the time when someone drowns in a swimming pool, there's someone nearby in the household that could run and save them if they only knew. The big problem that we face in society is that we think in drowning, someone flails their arms around and screams and says, help me. And actually drowning is this silent phenomena that can happen 10 feet away from a parent, for example, who doesn't even realize their child is drowning because it's silent, and they're under the water. That's guard.
I want to make another comment, and feel free to chime in, Chris, is before the metaphorical red carpet moment, is I want to quickly talk about confidence. It just hit me where your conversation about dyslexia is very empowering. He talks about our ability and capacity to identify strength and weaknesses and double down on strength and flipping the table on weaknesses so he can serve us in a very optimal way. I think likewise, like your ability to, I guess, overcome the insurmountable challenges through Shazam, identifying sound wave frequency beyond the database, everything you talked about. Because you went through your Shazam journey, I'm sure regardless it's a social entrepreneurship, impact driven or not, I'm sure you have this instilled belief and confidence that no matter what aheads or no matter what the guard ahead of time, you'll be fine because you survived Shazam. You didn't just survive, you thrived. So I want to actually conclude the conversation on confidence, where so many people in life, they want to go through life through this perspective, the path of least resistance. Of course, in entrepreneurship and in my military background, it's helpful. You don't want to run into the rain of fire, so to speak. You don't want to go against what VC tells you for the sake of ego. Of course not. But I think more often than not, because the nature of life, I think, and you would agree, is it's a mental game. Because it's mental, I think going through a path of high resistance often has a lot of fruits. And I think it's very, very advantageous for our growth. So I kind of want to just turn the back to you where how can you encourage us to maybe seek out more discomfort, which you alluded to earlier as well? Because as you and I know that underneath discomfort and behind the curtains of fear, there's so much opportunities of growth. And I'm sure you wouldn't have even thought about this new startup guard if you didn't have gone through your Shazam experience.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, there's no doubt that anyone would feel good from doing something that's beyond the expectations of what our people around us are expecting. That just seems natural to me. But the problem that we face is that doing that is hard, right? You face failures. It takes time. You have to be persistent, and it's very easy to sort of give up. I think the secret is to recognize and realize that it's going to take time. There's going to be disappointment, and that's built into it. So it bounces off of you. It's like recognizing that we all have ups and downs. Well, we also face challenges. You can't control everything. You can control yourself. You can't control everything. And so recognizing you can't control everything, and you are going to face difficulties and challenges and uncertainty and failures, and just accepting them, but remaining focused on your goal. So sticking with it is very achievable if you get into that mental state, and then also find a form of safety. And finding the form of safety, and this is the thing in the world of entrepreneurship, it's finding some way to survive in the meantime. Maybe you have a job and you're starting a company on the weekends. Maybe you build up a nest egg of savings to allow yourself a long runway of working as an entrepreneur. Maybe you find ways to fund things that where you have co-founders and people that are contributing that don't cost money. But basically you're finding your safety, and because we don't want to risk it all, but we can take risks. And so you find the balance In fact, you could argue that that's how I sort of ended up in keynote speaking as well, is that I knew I wanted to do this startup, but I also knew that it wasn't going to be a way to earn a living. And so I thought, well, oh, look, there's this other career that I also love of having impact, and I can earn a living through keynote speaking. And so for me, that's my combination, my safety, to be able to take risks and bet on things that, despite all the challenges I'm going to face, but also to have my safety so that I can get there.
Yeah, that's great. I guess it makes sense. So we're ending our conversation with the psychological through line, but also entrepreneurship undertone. It's like divesting risk, right? And I think that applies to business, but also in life, like relationships, just anything. And I think we do have to have certain level of risk analysis. And that's also a reason why I can keep doing podcasts in perpetuity, because as you said earlier, it is such an oversaturated market with AI, auto transcriptions, right? Text to video. These technologies are amazing. It's an amazing era to live in, but the competition is wild. But all that to say that I just want to really highlight your message, where I think whether in life, business, or entrepreneurship, find something that you love, really double down your passions by increasing your self-awareness of what you're good at, what you're not good at, and then delegate, by understanding that your vision's your vision. And I really think that the outcome aside, if you can really stick to it because your visions and passions are strong enough, it's fervor enough, I think that's worth it. Because we will never know this, but in a parallel reality, I'm sure if Shazam didn't have the Hollywood peak story ending like you talked about, I'm sure you still would have started another startup. You'd have kept going. Oh, yeah. It's not only because of the Hollywood ending you're where you are today. Maybe Chris would have been a different type of Chris. But I think your passion really speaks through this conversation. Without further ado, Chris, I really appreciate your time, your energy, your expertise.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Benoit. It's been a pleasure.
So where could people check you out, your websites, maybe the book, the new startup, everything in between?
Yeah, I mean, well, the book is a long ways away because I'm just starting it, but my website is the best place, which is just www.chrisjbarton.com. It's very simple.
Yeah, and everything, your website has everything on it. So, as always, I'll include all your information in the show notes below. But yeah, is there anything you want to close the conversation out with that we haven't really talked about? You feel passionate, pun intended, to share before we end today's conversation?
No, I think, that's it. I loved your focus on the mental resilience and the mental aspect of even entrepreneurship, right? Because it comes down to a mental game. And I think, my main takeaway is just the awareness of your strengths and your weaknesses, so that you can be aware of that and focus on what you're good at.
Amazing. Well, to all the listeners, if you have made it till this end, I appreciate your time. As always, I want to ask you to share this episode with one friend. If you learned that, wow, I could turn my weakness into a superpower the way Chris did, don't you want to empower a friend of yours? So if you derive any value, discover more action items from today's conversation, I want to ask you to share this episode with one friend. It's free for you, but priceless for the podcast's growth. And as always, I'll link all of Chris's information in the show notes below. And as always, I want to encourage you to choose curiosity and love over fear. The next week's train of Discover More. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you for checking out my conversation with amazing Chris today. Until next time.